One of the aspects of Farland Three Houses that was most compelling to me was the deep-seated philosophy of each of the house leaders that are what ultimately makes each of the leaders' positions irreconcilable, creating the conflict of the story. So this is a series that attempts to thoroughly investigate the worldviews of each house leader because their philosophies are quite nuanced and can be easy to misinterpret if you really don't think them through. There are two primary ways someone can interpret Edelgard's philosophy, either in terms of her overt pragmatic critiques of the world and in the very forces that drive her character. In this way, it's useful to separate Edelgard's philosophy into an explicitly stated one and one that silently underpins her actions and role within the game. Edelgard's explicitly stated philosophy uses the revolutionary and material productive ideas of Marx in conjunction with certain meritocratic sentiments.
People believe crests are blessings from the goddess, that they're necessary to maintain order in Fodlan. But the people are wrong. Crests are to blame for this brutal, irrational world we live in. Their power is granted only to a select few, whom we elevate and allow to rule the world. Have you ever wondered if the only way to create a truly free world is to dispense with the goddess and the crests? Do that, and people will have no choice but to rise and fall by their own merits.
And the philosophy underpinning her actions and role in the game is Kierkegaard's philosophy of faith. And it is actually in this understanding of Edelgard that her character is redeemed as heroic despite her dubious actions during every route except for Crimson Flower. I know it seems absurd to imply that Edelgard is fundamentally driven by faith because of her staunch opposition to the Church, but it'll become clear that this trait is part of what makes Edelgard a compelling character. Edelgard's overt political philosophy is essentially to lead a revolution against what she sees as an oppressive and exploitative system to change the conditions that perpetuate the unjust system of the Church. This framework for Edelgard's political philosophy is essentially Marxist in how it critiques the social hierarchy and espouses the necessity of revolution in moving beyond what she sees as an oppressive system. To put this in the context of Marxist thought, he does not believe that the consciousness of individuals determines their existence, but rather that social existence of humanity determines their consciousness. This statement implies that people's beliefs and identities are fundamentally, reflexively formed by the conditions of a given society that they find themselves stuck within. Edelgard reflects this exact idea in her discussion with Dmitri, where she states that the people of Fodlan will become strong after they are liberated from the oppressive conditions of the Church.
Even if one clings to their faith, the goddess will never answer them. Countless souls will be lost that way, living without purpose. And I can be counted among those who have died that way as well. But that's why I must change this world, on behalf of the silent and weak.
This connects to another shared view of Edelgard and Marx, that of religion. Marx famously claimed that religion is the opiate of the masses, believing that religion is a fundament of society that was a social abstraction which was constructed to alienate people from the very conditions of their oppression. Edelgard shares this sentiment, believing that the goddess does not exist, and that believing in the justice and fairness of the goddess is a means of holding people back through religious control. Edelgard's political philosophy is decisively clear as its Marxist influence goes, with many of her practical ideas drawing from his work. This would make it pretty perplexing that I would go on to claim that Edelgard's underlying philosophy is that of a knight of faith. However, while it may seem contradictory or confusing, it seems to be essential to the complexity of her character in how these two philosophies interact with one another. Now, to address the elephant in the room, how is Edelgard fundamentally moved by faith? Well, firstly, it's helpful to establish that Kierkegaardian concept of faith I'm referring to is different from a traditional conception understood through the Church, whereby a person of faith has belief in an institution or God. The faith that Edelgard has is a silent movement of faith, as described by Kierkegaard, where she is resolute in her difficult task, yet faces the dread and pain that is essential to her actions. Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith is an individual that understands their personal relationship with God and teleologically suspends ethics to fulfill this essential relationship. What is characteristic of Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith and Edelgard, however, is that they necessarily cannot feel completely grounded or certain in their suspension of the ethical because they constantly risk falling into their own temptations or risk submitting to an external god. Within Kierkegaard's framework, temptation and submission lie in between the traditional Christian dichotomy of Satan and God, or to put it in other terms, chaos and order. However, it seems that these two extremes can be found within Edelgard's story in the form of the Agarthans and her ideals, being temptation and submission respectively. The Agarthans continually attempt to whisper in her ear about the destruction of the church, and her ethical ideal is constantly giving her a positive end to sacrifice everything for. Edelgard's relationship with these two opposing forces exists within the silence intrinsic to her character throughout all of White Clouds and parts of the time skip, where her plans and motivations are hidden to most characters. The whole time that Edelgard attends the Officers' Academy, she lives with the knowledge that her convictions and planning will lead her to cause a war that will end what she sees as a system of oppression. When Edelgard begins to actualize her plans of revolution, she begins to lose herself in her cause without someone to keep her in check to continue her on her arduous path as a Knight of Faith. Edelgard only exists as a Knight of Faith within the Black Eagle's route because she is able to weather the forces of temptation over the course of her rebellion thanks to the stability and reassurance that Byleth provides. With Byleth by her side throughout the Crimson Flower route, Edelgard doesn't lose herself in her rebellion and remains the best version of herself, a Kierkegaardian Knight of Faith. Edelgard's underlying relationship to Kierkegaard's concept of faith also thematically fits within the context of Three Houses' world and narrative. The first example of this thematic syncretism is the nature of the Adrestian Empire being the region of the game that has a deep and storied history with the Church. This might initially seem like an insignificant detail, however, it's worth pointing out that many of Dimitri and Claude's traits are somewhat reflected by certain aspects of the nations that they represent, such as the chivalry of Fargus and the diversity of the Leicester Alliance. Furthermore, as myself and many others have pointed out, Edelgard shares many similarities with Rhea and serves as a distinct reflection of the Church's Archbishop. As such, within my Kierkegaardian interpretation of Edelgard's character as a Knight of Faith, I believe that Edelgard represents a submission to the ethical in the form of her consequentialist justification of any action to win, whereas Rhea represents falling into temptation, with many of her actions in life being centered around her personal desire to bring her mother back. Edelgard never does fall into the symbolic temptation that the Agarthans offer her through the catharsis of destruction, but without Byleth, she does ultimately submit to her universal moral goal and will do anything to win her war, such as making callous sacrifices and harnessing dark power to create beast soldiers. This is the fundamental complexity of Edelgard's character. On the one hand, she clearly maintains the practical revolutionary philosophy of Marx and her stated goals, and on the other hand, her personal journey is more spiritual and finds her fighting to stay true to herself and her purpose in life without giving in to the temptation of the Agarthans or submitting to her goals. As far as her character goes, this creates an excellent interplay between the material concerns of her goal and her more idealistic struggle in staying true to herself in the face of such a momentous task. Hopefully this video on the philosophy of Edelgard helped you appreciate her more as a character, because I know that in making it, I see her in a totally different way. If you like this video, please do all the average things that YouTubers shill for. It really helps, and the engagement is what makes making these videos worth it in the end. As usual, thanks for watching, and until next time.